James was forced to spend $1 million to bring Tu Diep home. Will he choose his company or his love? The wind howled outside the glass windows of the CEO's high-rise office, but inside James's heart, a storm much greater was raging. He had built his empire with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Every decision was calculated, every dollar earned through sleepless nights and hard-earned deals. But now, everything stood on the edge of collapse, not because of a bad investment, but because the woman he loved was in danger, and the only way to save her was to give up $1 million. Tu Diep's new home, a place meant to bring her peace and a fresh start, had been compromised. Someone had tracked her down. The same shadowy forces that once tried to bring down James's company were now reaching for her. Her safety, her life, was no longer guaranteed. James stood before the paths. On one side, his company, struggling, fragile, but still salvageable if he kept his capital. On the other side, Tu Diep, innocent, terrified, and now the target of a threat meant for him. The cost, $1 million in ransom, or rather, a deal to remove her from the crosshairs, relocate her again, and secure the secrecy of her new identity. But that amount would drain the last of his liquidity, endanger employee salaries, and likely destroy investor confidence. He had advisors screaming at him to walk away, to let go, to choose the greater good, but James didn't hesitate. He remembered her smile as she made him tea with hands still stained from harvesting vegetables. He remembered the way she held on to hope when he was facing lawsuits and betrayal. She had stood by him when even his board members turned their backs. How could he ever abandon her now? With a heavy heart but unwavering resolve, James signed the transfer, $1 million, gone in seconds, but in exchange, Tu Diep would be safe. That night, as the company's numbers turned red and messages from panicked investors flooded his phone, James sat quietly by her side, watching her sleep. He had chosen love over survival, a decision that could cost him everything he had built. But sometimes, the measure of a man isn't in what he gains but in what he's willing to lose for someone who once had nothing but faith in him. And in that moment, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who had finally made the right choice. The Price of Love, Part 2. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from James's decision hit harder than any financial storm he had weathered before. Investors pulled out, projects were frozen, employees whispered about the sudden decline, unaware of the sacrifice their CEO had made in silence, but James did not regret it, not even for a second. Tu Diep, now safe in a secluded villa in the countryside, was slowly regaining her peace. The nightmares had lessened. The constant fear in her eyes began to fade. She smiled again, timidly at first, but each time it reached deeper into James's soul, anchoring him to his decision. One morning, she walked into the kitchen holding a small tray of breakfast she made herself, sticky rice and slices of mango, his favorite. She looked at him, her eyes sincere. "I heard what you gave up for me," she whispered. "Why did you choose me over everything you built?" James didn't answer immediately. He placed the tray down and gently took her hand. "Because what's the point of building an empire?" he said, "if the person I built it for is no longer there to share it?" Her eyes welled with tears. "But now your company is collapsing. People are blaming you." "I'll rebuild," he replied firmly, "brick by brick, if I have to. But I won't rebuild it alone this time. I want you by my side, not as someone I protect, but as someone I build with." Moved by his words, Tu Diep nodded. That day marked a shift, not just in their relationship, but in their future. They began working together quietly, planning small ways to restart. Tu Diep suggested returning to the roots, supporting local farmers, using her own background to create community-based supply chains. James, once a titan of corporate strategy, now sat at a table with village leaders and listened. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the man who had exposed Tu Diep's location and forced James's hand, John, was watching. His plan to ruin James had worked, partially, but what he hadn't anticipated was the strength James drew from love. And now, James wasn't just protecting Tu Diep. He was preparing to rise again with a heart forged by loss, a mind sharpened by failure, and a love that no enemy could steal. The Price of Love, Part 3. Autumn arrived early that year. The leaves around the countryside villa turned amber and gold, a quiet reflection of change both outside and within. Tu Diep and James had grown closer not just as lovers, but as partners with a shared purpose. Every morning, they walked through nearby farms, talking with growers and workers. Tu Diep was radiant. This life, though modest, suited her. She was no longer just a girl James loved. She had become his strength. Together, they began laying the foundation for a new venture, Green Roots, a business aimed at helping rural communities distribute their produce directly to city markets. Unlike James's old empire, which thrived on scale and ambition, this one was born out of trust, simplicity, and healing. But as their hope grew, danger still loomed. One day, a letter arrived at the villa. No sender, no stamp, just James's name written in bold, black ink. Inside was a single line: "You bought her time with $1 million, but time's running out." James clenched the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. His mind raced. John. It had to be him. The message was both a warning and a threat. He had known the risk of exposing John's drug trafficking ring, but he thought he'd bought enough silence with that $1 million payment. He was wrong. That night, James told Tu Diep everything. No more hiding. She listened, quiet but calm, and then said with the resolve of someone no longer afraid, "Then we don't wait for him to strike. We fight back together." James nodded. For the first time, he saw in her the spirit of a woman who had endured pain, but refused to be broken. They contacted Tu, James's most loyal employee, who had gone underground to dig up more evidence. Tu had been tracking suspicious offshore transactions linked to John's front companies. Now, with legal backing and a growing alliance of partners who had once feared John, but now believed in James, the pieces were starting to come together. The plan was risky. Expose John publicly, freeze his assets, use the evidence James had secretly recorded months ago when John, unaware, had confessed to his crimes at James's hospital bedside. But the most dangerous step was yet to come. James had to go back to the city, alone, into John's territory. He kissed Tu Diep goodbye the morning he left. She held on to him a little longer, fear creeping into her voice. "Promise me you'll come back." He looked into her eyes, fierce but tender. "I promise. And this time, I won't lose anything worth fighting for." As he disappeared down the dusty road, the wind picked up, swirling leaves around Tu Diep's feet. She whispered a silent prayer to the skies, because love had already cost them everything. And now it was time to take it all back. The Price of Love, Part 4. The city hadn't changed, but James had. He stepped out of the car, eyes scanning the familiar skyline. The tall glass towers no longer impressed him. They looked fragile now, like illusions waiting to shatter. He wasn't just here to confront a rival. He was here to dismantle the world that almost destroyed him. At the edge of the city, in a private club only the powerful knew existed, John was waiting. Dressed in a tailored black suit, drink in hand, he looked calm, dangerously calm. "I thought I'd see you again," John said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You always come back for the things you're too weak to protect." James sat down across from him, sliding a flash drive across the table. "This contains voice recordings, offshore bank records, and testimony from 2 of your former partners. It's over." John didn't flinch. He chuckled softly. "You think this ends with evidence? No. I end this. I end you." James leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "You already tried. You failed. And now I choose how this ends." Suddenly, a group of uniformed officers entered the club. Behind them was Tu and a stern-faced prosecutor. John stood up, furious, but it was too late. "You're under arrest for money laundering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit fraud," the officer declared. As the cuffs clicked shut around John's wrists, his glare burned into James's face. "This isn't over," John hissed. "She'll never be safe." James didn't reply. He simply watched as the man who had haunted their lives for months was led away in silence. Back at the countryside villa, Tu Diep waited anxiously. Her hands trembled as she folded the same shirt 3 times. Then her phone buzzed. A single message: "It's done. I'm coming home." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Come back to me." Days later, James returned. The moment he stepped out of the car, Tu Diep ran into his arms. They stood in the golden light of dusk, not speaking, just holding on. After all the danger, after the fear, they were finally safe. "I thought I lost you," she murmured. James looked at her and smiled gently, gratefully. "You're the only thing I fought to keep." And from that day forward, they began to build not just a business, not just a home, but a life together, free from the shadows of the past. Because sometimes, love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice, and James had made his. Life lesson from James and Tu Diep's story. In the journey of James and Tu Diep, we learn a powerful lesson. True love is tested not in comfort, but in chaos. James, a successful CEO, was faced with an impossible decision: save his collapsing company or spend everything to protect the woman he loved. When faced with betrayal, danger, and the threat of losing everything, he chose love over power, safety over status, and sacrifice over selfishness. This story reminds us that love requires courage, the courage to risk everything for someone else. Success means nothing without someone to share it with. Integrity and loyalty are more valuable than money or fame. And sometimes, doing the right thing means walking away from everything you've built just to protect the one person who matters most. When storms come, when enemies rise, when fear clouds your vision, what will you choose? James chose love, and in the end, that choice gave him something no fortune ever could: peace, purpose, and a future built on trust. Let this story remind us, the heart, when guided by love, will never lead us astray. But the lesson does not end there. James and Tu Diep's journey teaches us that love alone is not enough. It must be accompanied by sacrifice, patience, and faith. There were moments when James had to step into darkness, when Tu Diep had to wait in silence, and when both of them had to trust each other despite the unknown. In those moments, we learn real strength lies not in control, but in vulnerability. James, once a man of logic and power, learned that opening his heart was far more difficult and far more rewarding than closing a business deal. True love is not found in grand gestures, but in quiet loyalty. Tu Diep stayed, even when it would have been easier to leave. She believed in James, not because he was perfect, but because he chose her in his most imperfect hour. Every storm reveals what truly matters. As the walls of James's empire crumbled, he saw clearly, money can be rebuilt. Love, once lost, may never return the same. The story is a mirror for our own lives. We all face moments when we must choose between comfort and courage, fear and faith, ambition and affection. Let us remember, you don't lose by loving. You only lose when you forget why you started loving in the first place. And sometimes, the most powerful act of success is choosing someone over something.